Have you got big questions about God? Are you wrestling with doubts?
Welcome to Questioning Christianity,
We believe that truth invites questioning, and that faith is not a blind leap in the dark.
but a response to the light of God's revelation.
So whether it's God's hiddenness or history,
Science or scripture,
ethics or evidence,
purpose or pain.
we create content to take questioners and their questions seriously.
We talk with scholars for expert insights and lay out the reasons why Christianity is worth believing.
Questioning Christianity.
Connecting the Christian story to life's deepest questions.
Well, welcome to Questioning Christianity, and my name is Dan Patterson. This is a kind of Christmas-themed episode with the eminent scholar, Dr. Joan Taylor. Joan is the author of a phenomenal book, Boy Jesus, which explores what we can know historically about the Christmas story and the mashup that our nativity scenes tend to represent. So with all of the objections that do the rounds this time on YouTube and TikTok from critics of Christianity and the mess of Christmas, I've brought Joan onto the channel to be able to ask away with all of your hard questions. Joan, it's phenomenal to invite you onto Questioning Christianity. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
You're actually in my part of the world right now. You're a bit of a jet setter around the world, you and your husband, both with an academic kind of investment in life and family in different parts of the world. But welcome to Australian shores for what is a very hot Christmas for our friends in the Northern Hemisphere.
Yes, it is, but I'm familiar with it being a New Zealander, so it's back to the heat of Christmas. It's lovely.
Absolutely. And just for our American friends that are watching in America, maybe confuses and thinks that New Zealand is part of Australia. They are, in fact, separate countries separated by a 3 or 4 hour flight. So, but we're honored to have you as a cousin in this part of the world. Let's jump into your work on your book, Boy Jesus, which I thoroughly recommend. And we've got linked in the show notes people can check out below. What inspired you to investigate and research this area of Jesus's early years?
It started to bother me that when I was teaching the historical Jesus, and I've taught the historical Jesus ever since the 1990s, from New Zealand to the UK, I always jumped over the infancy narratives, and it was this line that we can only know something about Jesus when he becomes an adult, when he goes to John the Baptist. So everything about Matthew chapter 1 to Luke chapter 1 2 is like, this is all legend. This is all just made up to prove certain things. And it was meaningful to the early Christians, but it has nothing to do with history. And the line was that really all you could know about Jesus in terms of his childhood was his name, Jesus of Nazareth. So he must have come from Nazareth. And this idea that he was born in Bethlehem was about creating an idea that fitted in with messianic expectations. So I was very skeptical about them for years and years. And then the penny dropped that given the dating of the Gospel of Matthew, really, that it was too early for everything to be totally legendary. The Gospel of Matthew is normally thought to have been written in the 80s of the first century. And I thought, hang on, it's one thing to say everything is legendary when we're at the end of the second century, you know, with various works written at the end of the second century that are very fantastical about thinking about Jesus. But it's too early to have everything made up from nothing in the Gospel of Matthew. And then it also made me wonder, you know, what was Jesus' life like as a child? I can certainly, even if I don't accept very much about the infancy narrative, I can surely situate him in a historical context, because we know about the historical context. And I didn't think anybody had done that. So those two things came together, and I thought, I must write this book.
Well, I'm really excited for that. And you do see, to be very fair to people who are more skeptically minded, legendary development over the centuries, just as you suppose. And take something like the wise men that supposedly visit Jesus in Bethlehem. We're not told in the gospel stories, for instance, how many there are, but by the end of the 4th century, with Saint Ambrose and with Saint Gregory of Nazianzus, they're now saying, well, there's 3 wise men, and give it another couple of centuries in the Latin translations, and you've all of a sudden got names for these guys as well, with Melchior and Balthazar and another Gathar or something like this. And so you do see that kind of legendary development over the centuries, but your idea is, wait, in the 1st century, this seems just too quick for these stories to have been invented wholesale. How do you approach, let's say, Matthew and Luke's Gospels historically? So given that they seem to tell different stories, there's a common core that Jesus is born in Bethlehem, but the details vary as to angels appearing to who and when, and to how the storyline details play out. How do you come at these sources historically to try and test whether you can take these stories seriously?
Well, again, I used to think of it as an either or, and influenced by many historical Jesus scholars who would go, well, the 2 accounts don't even agree. So how problematic is that in terms of history? And then the idea was you could only really accept where they overtly intersected, like the names of Jesus' parents, Mary and Joseph, Herod the king, born in Bethlehem. But even then, historical Jesus scholarship has gone the way of saying he wasn't really born in Bethlehem, even though it's there in both the Gospels. So that's how skeptical the field was, and probably still is, even with my book, but and is still not convinced. But I think actually what has been happening is people haven't seen that the Gospel of Luke Nativity is written sometime after the Gospel of Matthew. And in my book, I explore the fact that, explore the idea that actually that section of the Gospel of Luke even is the final bit of the Gospel of Luke to be added into it in an edited final version of the Gospel of Luke. So all of the Gospels, when they were written, the idea is that they were tweaked for a period of time. And so there's a what we call the living text period of the writing, where they're being communicated, their scribes are copying them, but maybe doing some tweaks, maybe doing some additions for a period of time. And that could be a short period of time for 10 years, or it could be a longer period of time for 40 years, for as far as we know. And in New Testament scholarship, there's an idea that the Gospel of Luke was tweaked for a while, as was the Gospel of John. So there's all sorts of scholarship about the phases of the Gospel of John until it finally reaches the form we have. And, for me, I think that's all fine. You think about the early Christian community was a community that really strongly believed the Holy Spirit was guiding them, and all sorts of oral traditions were circulating at the same time as things were being written down. So it's a time of dynamic creativity. So we shouldn't just kind of think, oh, it had to be written on one afternoon to be okay. It was actually a dynamic time. So the Gospel of Luke, I see as a response to the Gospel of Matthew, answering questions that arise from the very, very brief account in the Gospel of Matthew. We don't really get very much information, but it's very significant information we get in the Gospel of Matthew. But then the Gospel of Luke, in terms of the nativity, it comes along going, hey, but weren't there Jews also who celebrated Jesus' birth? It makes it all about these magi coming from the east, but what about the Jews? And so we have various Jewish voices celebrating the birth of Jesus, and a strong connection with the temple and the Gospel of Luke, which we don't have in the Gospel of Matthew. We have question answered like, why on earth did they go to Nazareth? By indicating they were already in Nazareth, they already had some connection with Nazareth before the birth in Bethlehem. and that explains why they went to Nazareth. Because in fact, the Gospel of Matthew's explanation of he shall be called a Nazarene doesn't easily tie in even with anything strongly biblical. There's nowhere in the Hebrew Bible where you have he will be called a Nazarene clearly spelt out. People say, oh, Isaiah 11, maybe, but we don't know. So there's questions answered. And in fact, if you read Luke as something that's answering questions arising from Matthew, it actually slots in really neatly together. And you can see that in the writing, this wonderful writing by a 2nd century author called Tatian. And he wanted to weave together the 4 Gospels. When it came to the Nativity, he could weave together Jesus' birth really neatly, just sort of jumping from Matthew to Luke and back to Matthew and then Luke. It doesn't actually conflict that much because you can weave Luke into Matthew. And we know this from all of our nativity plays where we see the kids performing nativity plays. It does actually fit together.
And there is that challenge, isn't there, that someone like Bart Ehrman raises, and he would say, well, we can discount the reliability of the infancy narratives historically simply because they do contradict, and particularly the foci tends to be around the ending of each of the Christmas stories. So in Matthew, it obviously ends with the slaughter of the innocents, which we don't have historically mentioned somewhere else, and we'll come back to that. But that has the Holy Family fleeing into Egypt to seek refuge until King Herod's death, and then they return to Nazareth after his death, that don't go to Judea because of his brother Archelaus. But in Luke's gospel, you have the temple traditions that are fulfilled and the blessing of Anna and the song of Simeon, but then they return to Nazareth. Seemingly, it just says that they return to Nazareth. It doesn't give kind of a timeline. And skeptics often point to this as a straight contradiction. Do you think that is a forced contradiction, or do you think you can meaningfully dovetail both of those accounts together in a reasonably natural way?
Yeah, you can. We're not actually given the precise sequence of dating of how everything slots together. So you could have the temple event, and then you could have the slaughter of the innocents afterwards. And Luke definitely sees the Holy Family going up and down between Nazareth and Bethlehem without so many difficulties. The slaughter of the innocents, it's this clue of any child under 2 years of age. So you've got the space that Luke could play with in terms of what the family were doing before they flee. And he grows up and learns, and that's what we would expect. And passing over the refugees in Egypt, okay, he's just going to pass over the refugee phase in Egypt. But it can be slotted together as Tatian did, without any difficulty.
Yeah, I've always found that just a strained contradiction. I mean, if you want to press the idea that Luke can't crunch the timeline and just have them end up back in Nazareth eventually in order for the next scene of his story, where you've got obviously the childhood story of Jesus at 12 going down to the temple for one of the pilgrimage festivals, that you've got this pattern of movement between Jerusalem, which is very close to Bethlehem, and then Nazareth, just shows the willingness of the family to travel, to do the pilgrimage, to do that sort of thing.
Exactly. And the Luke indicates a strong connection with Bethlehem right from the start, because they have to go to Bethlehem in order to have to register for this tax concept. We won't go into the whole issue of what tax it was, but it implies that they had property in Bethlehem. So it's not just, we're going to go to Bethlehem because it's our ancestral town. Anyone who read that in the Roman world would think, okay, they still have property in Bethlehem. And, I think that what happened, certainly in a previous generation of scholars, is they kind of had this idea that, okay, you just have to live in one place. You live in one place in the ancient world as now. You didn't travel around. There was no displacement. But actually, in terms of the modern world, we know that we can live in two different places for reasons of, displacement, crisis
Yeah.
situations. People flee. They still have strong connections back home, or for family reasons, they're a bit here and a bit there, or for jobs, they're a bit here and a bit there.
Yeah.
And actually, that was true in the ancient world too, particularly in Judea, where it was a very, very turbulent, unsettled, dangerous time to be living. And the overarching sense you get from both the nativity accounts is one of displacement. There's something not right in terms of this family. They are in two different places in the Gospel of Luke. They have to flee to Egypt, and then they go somewhere else in the Gospel of Matthew. Displacement is the theme. And if you don't get that, you're they have to be in one place and just live happily and peacefully. You're bringing something to the text. You're bringing an assumption to the text that is wrong. That's not what the text is telling us. So somehow we have to go with the fact that, okay, this is a family who were extremely displaced. How do we read that? That is the essential thing about the nativity accounts.
That's a really helpful challenge just on how we think about even biblical scholarship, that you've got generations or ways of thinking where we can end up importing assumptions that are unfair to the ancient context. And then just to read it within its own state, there's no necessary reason to distrust the testimony or the traditions that are incorporated into that text. And I just think that's a healthy caution. It's not saying believe every word, but it's just saying be careful not to disbelieve it because of pre-existing biases about how you think society operates. Yeah, well, that's really helpful. One of the other challenges then between reading the Christmas story in Matthew and the Christmas story in Luke comes down to the genealogies. So Matthew's gospel opens with a genealogy that particularly traces kind of through the royal line of David, through King Solomon. And Luke's genealogy in chapter 3, right around the baptism kind of situation, traces a different kind of genealogical line. And this really puzzles people because they both end in Joseph being the supposed father or adopted father of Jesus. But then you've got two different fathers of Joseph supposedly mentioned in two different lines entirely. What do you make historically or theologically about what the two different gospel authors are doing there with the genealogies? Is this a problem for people who want to treat the historical Jesus as being reliably communicated in the Gospels?
Well, I would go with the Gospel of Matthew as the core genealogy that was communicated by the family, because I think there's a lot of family stuff in the Gospel of Matthew, and it's earlier than the Gospel of Luke. So historically, we tend to prefer an earlier account to a later account, which is not to say that later accounts don't weave in a lot of oral tradition that is solid and interesting and good. But you can see how the Gospel of Luke does a bit of cut and pasting by simply the genealogy stuck there where it is. But the interesting thing is, it's important to have a genealogy. It's important to have that kind of identity, even in the Gospel of Luke, where the image being created of Jesus is somewhat different to the Gospel of Matthew's Jesus. They look at Jesus from a slightly different angle. So yes, you have this the baptism of Jesus, and then, oh, by the way, here's his genealogy. There's like, what was going on? So I think in terms of, it's important to have some form of genealogy because that was something that was important to Jesus and his family, to put in a genealogy. It's important to show his Davidic line. So both of them trace the line to David. And what the early Christians said about Luke's genealogy, as opposed to Matthew, is it jumps into a different place because in Jewish society at the time, there was this concept of levirate marriage. So Julius Africanus, an early Christian writer, he said, well, that the thing is that there are two genealogies because actually Joseph's father, that there was this practice of, if a man died childless, then his brother would have to raise up a child in his name, and so that his line would somehow continue. But in a genealogy, it might jump to the brother rather than the actual father. So Julius Africanus explained it that way, and Julius Africanus actually knew people who were relatives of Jesus, or knew their stories, because he has these stories about the relatives of Jesus in the early church as being very important in the Judean church. So I think, okay, well, if they could explain it in the ancient world like that, maybe that's a perfectly legitimate way of thinking about the genealogy, and one branch of the family preferred that genealogy to the one we have in the Gospel of Matthew. So, all right.
And it's interesting. I like the options being put out there. I've never felt quite compelled myself to any one explanation of the differences necessarily. But there's a couple of things that I appreciate about just putting out options, and you saying, well, how did genealogies function in the ancient world? Is a question that's very different to our sort of ancestry.com sort of approach these days, and that they usually carry certain ideas too. And my colleague David Dean just released a video on our channel earlier this week, exploring the different explanatory options that people have put out there. And one thing that I really like about, let's say, Matthew's depiction of Jesus as the fulfillment of Jewish expectations, that he is the messianic king arriving to deliver Israel, and then Luke's portrayal of Jesus more not just as a recapitulation of Israel's story in his baptism and his temptations, but actually as a recapitulation of the human story, with the genealogy tracing all the way back to Adam, and then the temptation in the garden mirroring the temptation in the wilderness. And there's just connections there where they're theologically doing different things, which I appreciate as well. But people want to check out that video maybe if they want to look more into the kind of explanatory options that are out there.
You're right. A genealogy is a story about identity. So that's the thing that you should be looking at, rather than just, how do they agree or not?
Yeah. There's an interesting question here from a friend of mine overseas that comes in about Matthew's genealogy. I'm curious if you've thought much about this. It says in Matthew chapter 1, Jeconiah in the lineage from which Jesus comes. But you've also got in Jeremiah 22 a curse that's placed on Jeconiah so that none of his offspring would sit on David's throne. Taking off your just historical hat for a second and maybe putting on a theological one. Any thoughts on how you would reconcile a problem like that?
I don't know. I don't think I can be the person to answer that question in terms of inconsistencies. And all I'm saying really is that it's important for the family to have created that narrative of a genealogy, and they would have had some explanation of that. And that the core thing is Davidic, and maybe they just thought in terms of that account in Jeremiah as belonging to a particular time, that Jeremiah was very angry. He was very, very angry with what had happened in Judea and the rulers of Judea. And actually God could do anything and turn that around. And I don't know what they would have thought.
Could lift a curse, maybe in the same way that Jesus is designed to lift the curse on creation by bearing that in himself. Maybe he's designed to lift the curse on this bloodline as well, or even like, purely like an apologetics kind of response. If you're looking for a way out, could be something like Jesus' virgin birth is a means of getting around this, because the male bloodline may not actually carry through given the virgin birth of Jesus. I mean, there are some of the things
that I've sorts of ways you can explain. But the genealogy is certainly doing something in terms of the story in the Gospel of Matthew, because of the women that come in, and not everybody is perfect. And the genealogy is really highlighting David, had his offspring with the wife of Uriah. It's just this sense that the men behaving badly is part of
Absolutely.
the theme of the genealogy.
Yes. This is not a
So
genealogy of righteous men from top to bottom. It's a
no,
genealogy of a bunch of very, very dark actions and characters that are included. Like
exactly,
you think of Judah and Tamar and their story that's in there, and Judah's horrendous
exactly.
failures. You think of Rahab's story being incorporated within. You think of
What's
Ruth as a
going
Moabite
on?
as being like it's beautiful the way that somehow these stories that are questionable and women who faced awful circumstances at the hands of men. Yeah, that's part of the mess out of which the light of the world comes. That's a beautiful
Exactly.
story in and of itself. Yeah.
Mm.
I'd love to get your questions, your thoughts on this. One of the maybe Islamic objections that's come up much more recently, in defense largely of Islam's teaching around the age of Aisha marrying the Prophet Muhammad, has also
Mhm.
been to say that Mary was profoundly young and potentially
Yeah,
prepubescent, certainly a child.
yeah,
And the idea that in the Annunciation of Gabriel to Mary, there is no concept of consent. And I don't want to use
yes,
the kind of
yeah,
language that gets used online to describe this, but you can imagine it's pretty dark. And just
yes.
saying she's too young, she gives no consent, and yet this pregnancy is forced upon her. What are your thoughts around what we see take
Mm.
place with the Gabriel's annunciation to Mary and of her response and of typical kind of history around when were young Jewish women being married at that particular point in time? It'd be great just to get
Mm.
anything you can in there.
Oh, yes, that's I touch on it a little bit in the book, but not fully. Absolutely, Aisha, she's 12, isn't she, when she gets married
She's
to the
6 when she gets married, and
that's
she
right.
and they consummate at
Yeah,
9. Yeah,
and she goes
yeah,
into the prophet's house still with her toys, I think that
yeah,
something.
correct, with her
Um,
dolls. Yep.
yeah,
Because and that's a key element because in their tradition, as soon as you're a woman, you're no longer able to have dolls. It's something you're only allowed to play with as a child.
mm.
Yeah.
So we're in a cultural world which is very similar to that.
Yeah.
It's betrothal could happen as children, and marriage could happen for girls when they've had a period. So 12, anytime from 12. And the Essenes, there was a group, a legal school group of scholars, you'd really call them, called the Essenes. And they considered themselves very righteous because they would wait until a girl had had 3 periods before they married the girl.
Sure.
So, you know, it could often be 1 period and she was eligible for marriage.
Sure.
So we have, in today's terms, child brides in the ancient world, all over the world. That was just common in the ancient Near East and in the Mediterranean world. So we have to be careful not to judge them by the standards of today. That was just their cultural practice, as it is in parts of the world today. And girls didn't have autonomy. They didn't have choice. They were under the sway of their fathers or brothers or uncles who were supposed to be looking after them. You only got autonomy if you were a really high-class woman and a wealthy woman, and you were given a sort of masculine persona. So the women of the imperial house in Rome would have great power and autonomy, or Cleopatra of Egypt, a great queen, princesses, queens, those sorts of high-class women, or women from wealthy families, well-born families, could have great autonomy and be philanthropists in their different cities. But ordinary women just didn't have that. So if you're going to judge Mary, you're sort of judging all girls and women in the ancient world. They submitted, that was what they thought was the right thing to do. The idea of submission, humility, modesty was just what was it. Femininity was about that. To be a good girl was about that. having said that, I do think there is quite a lot of autonomy in Mary, and that's shown in the Magnificat in the Gospel of Luke. So Luke takes you from the scene in which she is really given over to the power of the Holy Spirit, and she accepts it as according to God's will. She then, it's not just a story of her submission as a virgin girl. She's not submitting to her father's wishes here. She's not submitting to her husband's wishes. She's submitting to a divine calling. And the rest of what you have in the Gospel of Luke is really presenting Mary as a prophetess. She has the power of the Holy Spirit in her, and she testifies to Elizabeth. There's an outpouring of prophecy really in Mary when she goes
it's
to
so theologically rich, when someone says this is an uneducated girl, and you read the Magnificat, and if this is a meaningful historical record of her words, and Luke had Mary as a source, boy, that is such a rich theological song.
And it's wonderful, and she's been given this incredible role of being the mother to the future Messiah, Son of God. This is, so it's a
big deal.
It's complex. All these stories are far more complex than you think on a first reading. And again, don't judge them by today's standards. Think what they're actually saying in terms of the standards of the time, and it's flipping things around.
Well, there's something deeply dignifying about the role that God grants both to Mary in the very beginning as the one to receive the announcement of the Messiah's coming, as well as then the role that women play right throughout the gospel narratives as being key eyewitnesses along the way and contributors to Jesus's ministry and prompters of his first miracles, and the ones to announce the resurrection to the disciples. It's there a beautiful kind of dignity that's given to women there, which is profound. In terms of then the move, so Mary gives this annunciation. She retreats, according to Luke's gospel, to visit her cousin Elizabeth. There's 2 miracle pregnancies in that birth account. And Elizabeth, in her old age, having been barren now, is pregnant with John the Baptizer. You've got sort of this 3-month period where Jesus spends with Mary, which is sort of a curious response to her becoming pregnant and going to retreat there. But she returns, and I'm guessing by this time would be starting to show signs of pregnancy to some extent, and Joseph becomes aware and plans to divorce her quietly, but he then receives a dream in which the angel Gabriel kind of talks to him. And then at some point you've got the move from where they are in Nazareth to Bethlehem. And this is what you were talking about at the beginning, this curiosity around, is the Bethlehem story just an invention to fit the prophetic expectations of sort of Micah 5:2, and you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, will not be least among all the nations, but the rule is going to come from you. Is that just an invention, or what sort of, for you, credibility is there to the Bethlehem story? And particularly to Luke's, then you spoke about Luke answering questions that Matthew raises. Matthew just has them go to Bethlehem. Luke then suggests something that is highly controversial, which is the whole line around the census that is taken, that goes out throughout all the world, that Quirinius was governor of Syria at the time. Could you talk us through both? Do you think the Bethlehem story is credible historically? And what do you make of the supposed historical error that Luke makes when it comes to the way we understand the Quirinius line?
Yeah, there's a lot there. There's a lot in that question. Can I just rewind a little bit in terms of the? I think the Gospel of Luke with Mary going to Elizabeth is a response to where you have in the Gospel of Matthew, he says, thinking to send her away quietly. That it's not the word in Greek meaning send her away could also mean divorce, but I don't think Joseph is thinking of divorcing her. He's thinking about keeping her out of the town,
the public eye. Sure,
people won't know when exactly she got pregnant. So I think Luke develops that, and she has been sent away.
Okay.
And then she comes back
Interesting.
to Joseph when he's
That might be a
reassured.
response to this question from Rebecca Early, who said regarding Elizabeth's seclusion, was there a cultural reason? And that may well be it. So thanks for speaking to that.
Yeah, okay. So I think Luke is going, yes, he did send her away. We've got her, connecting with Elizabeth here. And again, moving around to the Judean hill country. So Mary is on the road quite a lot already before she goes down to Bethlehem from Nazareth.
She's used to it. Yeah.
She's used to it.
Yeah.
She's
Yeah.
off on her donkey. And so so then there's this question in terms of Bethlehem, Micah 5. Scholars have been less sure about the idea of how much it was expected that a Messiah would come from Bethlehem. There was this idea of the line of David very strongly, but in early Judaism, certainly, that you can't see in any of the writings about the Messiah, even though it's strongly Davidic, the Messiah is going to come from the Davidic line. You don't actually have in the Dead Sea Scrolls or any of the other contemporaneous literature, well, we're really expecting a Messiah from Bethlehem.
There was no Messiah watch on the walls of Bethlehem.
Yeah. I mean, clearly, I think Herod was concerned about Bethlehem because he built his palace of Herodium very, very close to Bethlehem. It overlooks Bethlehem.
Interesting.
And it was a town where many descendants of David did live. I think that's the thing about Bethlehem. But later on, there were Jewish acclaimed messiahs like Bar Kokhba in the 2nd century, who led a huge revolt against Rome in the years 132 to 136. And Rome came in and absolutely annihilated that revolt, and actually annihilated huge numbers of villages in Judea. It was a devastating time for Jews and Judeans in the middle of the 2nd century. But there's nothing about Bar Kokhba being born in Bethlehem. So people were prepared to believe that he was the Messiah without him being born in Bethlehem. So then there becomes this question of, did they have to make their nativity accounts all about Bethlehem? Because they could have done something else. They could have really insisted on the Davidic line and said, well, Nazareth was a kind of new Bethlehem. There were a lot of people there, and done something else in terms of scripture. And Bethlehem at that, and thinking about Bethlehem at the time of David and his descendants being very important, but actually the Judean kings were living in Jerusalem, not in Bethlehem. So wouldn't Jerusalem have been a better place? I don't know. It's really
it just
hard.
means the narrative impulse then, if they were inventing traditions rather than relating what happened historically, there's no reason they have to invent Bethlehem to fit what was a hard mold at the time.
Yeah. It's nice if it was Bethlehem, but it didn't have to be Bethlehem. And there was even a completely different concept of the Messiah, the heavenly Son of Man, the Danielic. If you look at Daniel 7, the Son of Man who comes from the clouds, this concept of the Messiah, which is very strong in the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark preferred that kind of Messiah for Jesus. And almost wanted to distance Jesus from Bethlehem in the Gospel of Mark. So they could have gone down that route entirely, but instead they went and said Bethlehem because it was part of the family tradition. It was where he was born.
So what then do you make, that's really helpful, of the Quirinius element in Luke's gospel? Because, historically we can show that Quirinius was governor in Syria from 6 AD onwards, but this birth story is really happening 6-ish BC. So sort of, 11 years prior. Correct. And so when Herod the Great's still around, do you think that's a historical error on Luke's part, or do you think that this is just a mistranslation where we're meant to say this is the first census that took place before Quirinius was governor or something like this. What's your read on that sort of element?
Well, in all of these things, I'm really interested in memory and storytelling. So how do you weave together family memory, memory of the early Christians in Jerusalem and Judea and Galilee broadly, and historical events? And I think that by the time you get to the Gospel of Luke and what Luke is doing with the Nativity, there's this elements of memory that people remember in terms of what Augustus did in terms of broad taxation, censuses of Roman citizens. You've got a specific registration when Quirinius when Coponius became governor of Judea after Archelaus in 6 CE, and there needed to be a registration for a Roman taxation system in Judea. And you've got these welded together, and you've got them connected with the story of Jesus, which is one of displacement and going back and forth between Nazareth and Bethlehem. So you've got actually different true historical things that have been woven together. And it's not like the whole world, as it was in the Gospel of Luke, was taxed in the time of Quirinius. That we can't say that from ancient history. We know that correctly Quirinius was governor of Syria. Good, tick. We've got a correct census, tick, at the time of Augustus. We've got registration in the time of Coponius, tick. There's all sorts of historical elements, but they've been woven together in order to tell a story. And it could very well be that that Joseph and Mary did go to Bethlehem at that time for some reason, and it was to do with Herod the Great, and it was to do with something that Luke hadn't quite got right, or had chosen not to use for a bigger narrative about Rome. And that bigger narrative about Rome is very strong in both the nativity accounts. Both of them are concerned with Rome in different ways. So that's the story we need to hang on to.
Yeah, I think the sort of reconstruction elements are fascinating. And it's sort of often for me, whenever I come across these problems, I'm not necessarily trying to wriggle out of them so much as just say, how do we make sense of what's going on here? Yeah. Particularly when the gospel authors tend to have a very good track record of reliability in terms of major people and appointments and places and all the other core details. So yeah, it just sort of leaves the question mark hanging there. And I like that sort of the memory attempts. We know all these things are going on, and how do we kind of give voice to that? So that's really useful. Rather than just the forced fulfillment of the Bethlehem story, one of the kind of key elements in the nativity that we're familiar with, the one that gets retold in Christmas plays every year, it sort of has Mary and Joseph riding in on a donkey into Bethlehem. Mary is heavily in labor. They're desperately trying to find somewhere for her to go. They go to the local motel with their donkey. There's a big no vacancy sign out the front. The innkeeper sends them outside Bethlehem down the road to a stable or a cave where they give birth amongst farmyard animals. Walk us through probably what happened with the whole Bethlehem scene of Mary and Joseph are there. Was Jesus born in a stable? Is this a mistranslation of the Cataluma kind of phrase? Just what would be your best reading then of the narrative story from Matthew and then the kind of shepherds from Luke as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's the sense of displacement. It's very, very much a struggle story. It's not a peaceful, it's not Silent Night, Holy Night. It's not a peaceful, everyone's calm and joyful. You're calm and joyful in a little bubble in an absolute mess of terrible things happening. And the last thing you want to do as a woman in your third trimester is to be on a donkey and traveling, and so there is this sense of disturbance, and that's the story that's being told. And there's the story of already being displaced in Nazareth and having to return to Bethlehem So you're already an immigrant in Galilee when you're actually a Judean who should be in Bethlehem. There's an expectation probably that there would have been family members you could stay with, and everything is wrong. So that story to me is, people not, there's such a sense of maybe terror or fear or something going on that there's no place for a pregnant woman to give birth. And if you think about the situations where that happens, it happens when people are fleeing war, very, very terrible situations. So it gives you a signal that this isn't just a calm census of let's everyone go home. It's something very wrong in the situation. And that situation of everything being wrong goes on where, we don't even have any room anywhere for a woman to give birth, or but some space where there are animals, a donkey area. So manger, donkey feeding trough, a smelly animal feeding trough. So Jesus and family are in amongst the donkeys. In the ancient world, of course, people did live with their animals often. They had animals with them. So there would have been a back of a house where that was the room that was available, where the animals, usually donkeys, would be. So there is this sense of trouble. And that continues on really with the concept of the shepherds watching their flocks by night. We think, oh, isn't that lovely? Why were they watching their flocks by night? Because
it's dangerous.
It's dangerous. Wild animals, wild cats in the Judean wilderness would come into the corners of Bethlehem. So you had to stay alert all night. And that in itself is a huge symbol for what's going on. You've got the census, Rome, Augustus saying all the world is going to be taxed, all the world, and you've got shepherds watching their flocks by night, and the two elements are very, very related. So when you have the angels coming, good news to all people, it's really, again, sort of saying something back against Rome. A savior, well, Augustus Caesar, in all of his inscriptions, would claim to be Son of God. That's one of his titles, because he was the son of Julius Caesar, adopted son of Julius Caesar, who was proclaimed as a god. So he was Son of God, and he was Savior, and that was how he promoted himself. So the language of the angels is actually a language that gives good news to Judeans in the light of the fact that they are under the control of this very unyielding power in the world, and they had no autonomy, and they had to do what Rome told them to do. So there's so many elements of the story that come together. And I feel like these sorts of stories can happen in terms of family retellings of the stories of what happened to family members in previous generations. So, I don't know about you, but I have stories from my mum on my Danish side about the Nazi occupation of Copenhagen. I have stories on my dad's side, my British grandmother about her life in the First World War, things like that. So these memories, I can tell those memories.
Yeah,
I can tell
them. It's interesting, isn't it? And that's really helpful for people to think about this, because sometimes even skeptically minded protagonists might accuse the gospel authors of coming up with stories 50 years after Jesus died. But like you've shared, these are really oral traditions or memories that have been not just forgotten and then retold 50 years later out of the blue. They're things that are passed on. They're retold again and again to different groups who can receive that and steward those memories as well, which I always found just an interesting feature. There's some stories in my past which I retell a lot because they're pertinent, and you get to new people you meet, they ask you questions about your past, and you end up sharing them quite a bit. And so the details of those memories stay very fresh, whereas someone will recall a person or a situation I've been in from the past that I haven't thought about for 30, 40 years. And the details are a lot more fuzzy as to whether or not I can remember that accurately. So I always found that an interesting feature of what's happening with gospel material as well. Can you give us a bit of a timeline of events? So how long, given the story in Matthew's gospel around the appearance of the Magi, and I've got some questions about their identity as well, but the appearance of the Magi, how long do you think it's likely that the Holy Family stayed in Bethlehem? Because we kind of crunched the timeline, I guess, where the nativity scene will also have the Magi appearing on the Christmas night, the same time as the shepherds. They're kind of fighting to get in the door, but Matthew's gospel seems to put that later. How do you think about the timeline there?
Well, I think that story of shepherds, the angels say to the shepherds, "This will be a sign for you, that you'll find the baby wrapped in swaddling clothes lying in a feeding trough." The sign is like your savior is going to be in an animal feeding trough. That is itself saying so much. But then Matthew doesn't go down that road. Matthew goes for a much, I think, quite a drawn out narrative, a drawn out chronology, and one in which different memory elements are being put together, because the core story is about Joseph. The Gospel of Matthew is all about Joseph's ability to have dreams that are very, very pertinent to events, where he feels like an angel has come to him in his dream, but it's this interpretation of a dream bouncing off the Bible, and then thinking, well, how am I going to preserve my family through this very, very troubled time? And the troubles, really the Magi are part of the troubles. There's a star that's part of the troubles. These people who come from the east are following a star, thinking that it's going to be some ruler born in Judea. Herod is deeply disturbed by that.
They kind of create the political conflict, like if you think foreign dignitaries, usually these are court, like members of a royal court, turning up probably not by themselves. Like, I'd assume if they're traveling with expensive gifts, they may have some kind of entourage to protect them, depending on their status. And you think they turn up and they say to King Herod, "Who is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We've come to worship him."
From your household.
Jeepers. Like, you think about creating a problem for Jesus. They have just lit all of what we understand of King Herod's murderous desires already to protect his power from his own sons. They've just lit those concerns on fire with the birth of another. And
so there's all this, as you say, there's all this backstory that I think readers of the Gospel of Matthew knew about Herod, because when he appears, he goes, "Herod, King Herod," there he is. And we know somehow that he's a baddie. He is a baddie. And he is opposed to the family. Really, you have to be afraid of him the moment you hear of him. So there's that sense that the family are not going to be on the side of Herod. Herod was the appointed Roman king of the Judeans. He was the client ruler. He was the arm of Rome in Judea. And for all the things that he did, like killing 3 of his own sons in the end, before he died, he generally did a good job by Roman terms, because he kept the peace in Judea. So they were fine about Herod. Rome thought, okay, good. He's a good guy. He's one of our people who's keeping control over our territory. But whoever they are, the Magoi, the Magi who come from the east, in the book I say, well, how much are they really from Persia, from Parthia, because that's Rome's enemy? And would they have been let into Judea? they had backed a rival claimant for the throne of Judea in the year 40 BCE, and the Romans had to, well, in Roman terms, quash them and install Herod. So Herod took control in 37 BCE with Roman help, with the armies of Mark Antony coming in and really doing some devastating things in Judea and installing him there as Rome's guy, and seeing off the Parthians. So you wouldn't really get a group of Parthian astronomers going, "We've seen a star rising in the east, and we think there's a new king."
You wouldn't get a favorable response, that's for sure. When I toured, my wife and I were in Israel in 2013 for a couple of weeks, and we ended up doing this part of a tour that was run by a secular Israeli tour guide. And his take was fascinating. He didn't at all believe the Matthew story about Herod's slaughter of the innocents. He was convinced that Herod in the ancient world has been casted badly by Josephus and by the gospel accounts, and that Herod was actually a really good guy because he was the bridge modernizing Judea and helping to do these huge building works to be able to help lift the economic boost. So he saw Herod as a good guy and just said, there's nothing to the slaughter of the innocents. Surely if that sort of heinous act was done, we'd have other historical sources confirming it. Or what's your sort of read then on the Matthew 2 account of the slaughter of innocents in Bethlehem, of his ordering every male child 2 and under to be killed? Do you think that is historical? Do you think it at least comports with the character of Herod that we know about? Would you expect that event would be recorded by others at the time?
I see it, as everyone will see in the book. I think it's very interesting that there was a massacre by Herod of people in the Bethlehem region at that time in 40 BCE, when Herod was fleeing Jerusalem. He fled south. He would have fled just past Bethlehem. And what Josephus, the historian everyone relies on, tells us is that local people came out and tried to attack Herod just in that area. So we're thinking local Bethlehem people. And Herod fought back and he massacred them. And at the site of the massacre, or very near the site of the massacre, near an older fortress, he built his palace, and that is called Herodium, and it looks over Bethlehem, and he even built his tomb there. So Herod's tomb has been discovered, and if you stand on the platform of Herod's tomb and look out, you look towards Bethlehem. So he, there was the idea of Micah 5 with the Messiah coming from Bethlehem. Take it or leave it. It's not that important, but it was there. And there was also the fact that local people had tried to attack him. So the local people of Bethlehem were not on Herod's side.
Sure.
And in that environment, so there's a memory of an actual massacre, and that I think has fed into our story in the Gospel of Matthew. There really was an actual massacre there of young men. And you can imagine people going, our babies are killed by this horrible man, Herod. And that story being told and told. But the chances of him doing horrible things to the people of Bethlehem at different times,
it's very reasonable.
Not every story is going to be recorded by Josephus. He relied himself on a narrative by Herod's own court chronicler, Nicolaus of Damascus, which was trying to spin everything about Herod in a nice way. And currently historians are saying, oh, well, let's look at what Nicolaus says, and Herod is a nicer character. But every now and again, Josephus puts in the other story, which is absolutely ghastly, heinous stuff going. And even Nicolaus would put in some of this heinous stuff, but say Herod was justified in doing these terrible things to his son because they were rebelling against him. But, Josephus is the one who says, well, Nicolaus doesn't record this, but Herod desecrated the tomb of David in Jerusalem in 10 BCE. He went in and looted it. So the idea that Herod was against those who were from the Davidic line is there in Josephus. He does terrible things to people who are from that line.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
Rome wanted that because Rome was worried about the Davidic line.
Yeah. And it's interesting, like I've heard arguments before, just historically, about population size of Bethlehem at the time, that you're sort of looking between 300 people to 1,000 people. And if you work out how many births per average and how many would we actually be talking about being killed, it'd be somewhere between sort of 9 and 40 births of boys 2 and under, then that would kind of count for. And so, that's not a wild historical event by comparison to the kinds of things that Herod was doing elsewhere. So, I mean, these are all sort of historical estimations, and we just don't have additional sources. But it doesn't seem to me that the slaughter of the innocents is entirely out of character with Herod's history with the people of
It's
Bethlehem.
not out of character, though. I do think of Bethlehem as a much bigger town.
Sure.
I've just written an article for the Biblical Archaeology Review. It's out in the Christmas issue, all
Okay.
about how Bethlehem is likely to have been a bigger town because an aqueduct ran through it. And
Sure.
to build an aqueduct to go through,
It's quite an expensive process.
yeah, they were
Yeah.
trying to build it up.
Interesting. Okay, that's really helpful. Very interesting. Well, do you have any ideas then around the identity of the Magi? Is that a phrase that has more specificity to it, or is that something that we just kind of don't know? These are just astronomers from a foreign court that is
East.
relatively unknown.
I think it's possible that a bit of the story of the Parthians coming in and installing a rival king in Mattathias Antigonus in 40 BCE is there in the weaving together of different memory elements. But Justin Martyr in the 2nd century, a Christian scholar in the 2nd century, was absolutely adamant that they came from Arabia, from Nabatea. And he just assumed that they came from the Nabatean kingdom. In fact, Herod's mother was Nabatean. There were a lot of contacts between the court of Herod and the Nabatean court. It was a very difficult relationship at different times. They went to war at different times, but overall there was a relationship with the Nabatean kingdom, whereas there wasn't with Parthia. Parthia, you have to think of, Iran and Israel today. That was the relationship between the Parthians and Herod in Jerusalem and Rome. So it's much more likely they came from Arabia.
Super interesting. And then in Matthew's account, obviously the slaughter of innocents, or at least the threat of that command that Herod gives, is the prompting for Joseph to receive in a dream a warning to leave, and records that then Mary and Joseph and Jesus travel to Egypt for a period of time until Herod's death in 4 BC. What do we know about where they went, what they did? I remember visiting Cairo and being shepherded to all of the places that the Coptic Orthodox Church traces back the history of the Holy Family. And I mean, you get all of these interesting sort of controversies from those who would talk about conspiracy theories about Jesus learning Egyptian mysteries and traditions during that period. So I'm just curious what you would see as maybe any early accounts or sources that we have for what happened during their time in Egypt.
Yeah, I mean, I really went into that and thought about where they could have gone, and obviously the big place that Jews fled to was Alexandria on the coast of Egypt. But there doesn't seem to be any particular connection between the Holy Family and Alexandria. They seem to, Egypt proper. Alexandria was called Alexandria by Egypt, officially by Rome, and it was very much a Greek colony, then turned into this Roman city.
And that's where we've got Philo from as well, the contemporary
Philo,
Jesus. Yeah.
A big Jewish community in Alexandria, but Jewish communities all over Egypt at that time, Heliopolis. And I was interested in the fact that the oldest tradition in terms of the Holy Family in Egypt has them connected with this place called Hermopolis Magna, which is quite far south down the Nile. and there were early Christian traditions about them living there. And interesting to discover in the papyri that have been found in Egypt that there was a Jewish community in Hermopolis Magna. So what can we say? There was a Jewish community there. There's an early tradition that they went there. That's all you can say, really.
That's all we know.
The Holy Family tour of Egypt. I'd love to go on that, but again, the underlying idea of the literature all about that, which comes much later, this much more legendary literature, is that if you were a refugee, you were on the move, life was very hard. And I think that's the story that we have to hold on to in terms of of Joseph, Mary, and Jesus, that he had this displacement. It would have been in family memory that he was displaced. In the story of Matthew, when Joseph feels he can go back to Judea, they think, oh, hooray, we can go home. But then when he hears Archelaus, Herod's son Archelaus, is in charge in Judea, they swerve off to Nazareth. They don't immediately go back to Bethlehem. So that, again, implies there's been trouble in Bethlehem. It's this ongoing trouble in Bethlehem narrative that you get that then means that they have to live in Nazareth and they're safer in Nazareth than in Bethlehem.
And let's talk about that then. So Jesus' early years, we've got his birth somewhere 7-6 BC, something like this, the flight to Egypt, you've got Herod dying in 4 BC, and then their return to Nazareth. And so Jesus is obviously a bit older than 30 when he starts his ministry, and that's sort of fun to kind of pick out how old do we think he was when he died. But these years before he starts a public ministry, they're based in Nazareth. We only have one, let's say, canonical story of what happens, and that's the story of Jesus being 12 and going to the temple. What else do we know about Jesus's early years, from Joseph's profession, Jesus' profession, likely work in the region? I'm curious to see, and I know there's a lot of Gnostic source material which I've read and reviewed, and in and around Jesus' early years, but particularly the infancy gospel of Thomas being one of the key standouts. But I'm curious about your sort of take. What do you think historically is a plausible reconstruction of his early years?
Well, yes. Currently, there's a film about to appear called The Carpenter's Son, which you might see is doing the rounds in about a week's time. It's coming to Australia, and I've been asked about that, and I've seen some clips of it, and so just content warning, it's nothing to do with the actual biblical story of Jesus. It's all based on this infancy gospel of Thomas, also called the Predicat.
You heard it here, folks.
Yeah, and
so
don't go thinking, oh, the carpenter's son, let's go to this lovely biblical film, because it's a horror movie, and it's as far as I can see, about Jesus sort of being tempted by Satan as a child. So they bring the temptation story into Jesus' childhood, and he does terrible things, and he's got this power, and he does these very disturbing film. So
maybe for those who haven't seen the infancy gospel of Thomas, it sort of begins with Jesus creating a series of clay birds that he brings to life. And then the kids start to make fun of him, and he curses them, and one of them dies. And then his teachers, he's cursing, and some of them get sick or die. The parents who get upset at him for killing their kids, well, he curses them, and some of them die. And so it's just so people are aware, the contents are wildly different to the character of Jesus that's portrayed across the Gospels.
Yeah. And it's interesting, it's been made into a film. Obviously, it's out there in terms of literature. It was quite popular in the early Christian world in all sorts of circles, but it presents Jesus as a kind of boy god in terms of the pagan model of a god who just zaps your enemies if you're angry with them. So theologically, there's quite a lot problematic with the infancy gospel of Thomas.
So if we were to let you rewrite that movie
Yes.
and you got to write a movie about boy Jesus based more plausibly on what we know about the history of his family, and you're just trying to fill in the backstory yourself, what would you imagine?
Yes, I should say the Infancy Gospel of Thomas does include the story of Jesus in the temple right at the
Yeah.
very end of it, like it's tacked on, like it's okay, we've got the story of Jesus in the temple. But I think that story of Jesus going to the temple when he was 12 has its basis, again, in family memory. It's the sort of thing, the stories that you tell about your children where, oh my goodness, the day we forgot to pick you up out of kindergarten or something, we all have these stories.
Well, Joan, I'm thankful to admit I have not yet forgotten to pick up my 3 boys, so touch wood. Yeah.
But that's a sort of, we lost you in Jerusalem. We left with the caravan back to Nazareth, and you weren't in the caravan of all of our village. And we thought
you can imagine why that story is anchored in their memory because of the trauma. You think as a parent, if you lost your child for 3 days, oh my goodness.
Yeah, exactly. And then when they find him, it's like, oh, we've been looking for you everywhere, which is exactly what you do when you've lost your child and you find them, go, you must have been going about your father's business. It's like they have forgotten that whole story about Jesus' birth and what they experienced. They were just upset parents. So I like the upset parent story of the Gospel of Luke. And I think Jesus would have done the right thing in staying in the temple, quite regardless of how he felt about it. It was a safe place. There was places to sleep and people would give you food. So being around where the teachers were, you get the sense of him wanting to understand, wanting to learn. This is a child hungry for learning and wanting to engage. And it's, so I like that story. I think there's a germ of truth in it, even if you say that some things were massaged by Luke in order to tell the bigger story that Luke is telling overall in the gospel.
What would have been likely of Jesus's education up until this point? I mean, he's living in Nazareth. He's got local access to synagogues that are there. What was expected of Jewish boys at the time?
So they're expected to be able to be familiar with Torah, the Mosaic law. Josephus is quite clear about that all people of Judea had to abide by the law of Moses, and the boys were educated, and this is important to make sure that everything was done correctly in terms of the law of Moses. That was what you were tasked with as a Jewish boy who would then, once you were older, really have to abide, and it was your responsibility to keep your family on that path. So that would have been done, but probably not at a very sophisticated level. But in Boy Jesus, I do think what we get a clue about is that Joseph himself was a sophisticated Bible reader, so sophisticated that he was really open to divine guidance in terms of his Bible reading, in terms of understanding the times, looking for prophecy. He has this prophetic element about how he's reading scripture, dreaming, feeling the angel come to him and being able to guide his family and so on. So I think he would have had a lot of education at home, as well as the standard education that you would have got in a village like Nazareth. So it's not just village scribes teaching Jesus, it's also home-based learning within his family. So I see Joseph as a tremendously important figure for Jesus. In terms of Christian tradition, we often get the image of the Blessed Virgin with baby Jesus. It's all about Mary and Jesus, and Joseph can be a bit sidelined. But I would like to put Joseph right back in there as a very, very important father to Jesus, who not only teaches him carpentry, but teaches him the richness of biblical literature and how to go into it and open up his own heart and mind and spirit. So as someone who is growing up with a father like that, Jesus is then prepared then to understand his destiny, understand what he needs to do to go to John the Baptist and what he needs to then do in terms of his mission. So it's the hidden story of Joseph, really, as a teacher that I would like to see in Nazareth.
And we know Jesus would have obviously spoken Aramaic as sort of the primary language that he communicates in. A lot of the earliest phrases in the Gospels that remain untranslated, maybe transliterated but untranslated, are in Aramaic, like the Talitha Kum or the Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, or some of these really guttural or powerful moments that are remembered fresh in the words of Jesus rather than translated. But would Jesus have been studying Torah in Hebrew or in the Septuagint version? Because it seems like later on, much of the New Testament writers are working from Septuagint translations of the Old Testament. What do you think is more likely?
Yes, I mean, we do have a disjunction between the Aramaic language period of Jesus' first followers in Jerusalem and wider Judea, Galilee, and the fact that we've got Greek Gospels. We've got the Gospels coming from outside the land where Jesus grew up, his own country. So there is that, we have to say that we hope that the Greek translates the Aramaic accurately, and trust that it does. And there are different takes on some sayings of Jesus in our Gospels, possibly because there are different understandings of the underlying Aramaic, and people have done slightly different things in terms of the tweaking of translation. You know, any translation is also a little bit interpretation as well. You can never get perfect correspondence. But we hope we have the ballpark figure. You know, we have everything pretty well lined up. But yes, he was Aramaic speaking, and the idea is that you would be able to read scripture in Hebrew, or at least have some kind of rote learning that would enable you to read it out in Hebrew, even if you didn't understand Hebrew. Hebrew was spoken in Jerusalem and around about in Judea. So my sense is actually that in Bethlehem, his family could have been Hebrew speaking because Hebrew language was spoken there. But in Nazareth, Aramaic was the main language, and his adult language was very much Aramaic. But he might also have understood some Greek as well, because there was a lot of Greek around and about.
Massively. Up there around the Sea of Galilee and different Greek cities, and
different trading with different ports, where it's not that far away, and the Greek Greek-speaking cities of the coast. So we think in terms of to get back to the beginning of our conversation, scholars have thought in terms of you just speak one language. Well, you didn't necessarily in the ancient world.
And a lot of places today don't either. We've got friends in Europe that speak multiple languages from birth.
Exactly. Yeah. What is this one language concept that we've got?
Yeah, so it's really interesting just thinking about that. And in terms of like Joseph's influence, so we hear of Jesus being referred to as the carpenter's son, and know that there's some fluidity in that term. Are they working with wood, and the beautiful imagery that is at stonemasonry and the big quarries that are nearby, and the work to build nearby cities. What would Jesus's upbringing have been like then, in terms of the shift between education and then work, family responsibility to care? Joseph obviously moves off the scene, it seems to be, by the time of Jesus's ministry, but we don't have any record of that. And try and fill in maybe the 12 to 30-ish when Jesus starts his ministry, what that window would have been like.
Yes, so at some point Joseph dies. I think that's clear. Joseph is not around at the time of Jesus' ministry. So what happens? I see Jesus as the eldest son. I think the Gospel of Matthew tells us that he was the eldest son, because at the end of the nativity account of the Gospel of Matthew, it says that Joseph did not have relations with Mary until Jesus was born, after Jesus was born. And that is a kind of arrow to, and he had brothers and sisters. And Matthew later on talks about Jesus' brothers, and he names them, and all his sisters, you know, how many were there? So there's this sense that he was part of a family, and if he was the eldest male and his father died, he would have considered his role was to look after his family. Yeah. So I see him being very family orientated. Brothers and sisters matter a lot to him, so much so that he uses the family and his concept of sibling care as a model for the whole church. So he includes everybody then in the family, and they're all his brothers and sisters. So the Gospel of Mark does this thing where in an incident or both in terms of Capernaum and in Nazareth, there is this question about him and his family. And the Gospel of Mark wants us to feel secure about being disciples and brothers and sisters of Jesus. So it's very much concerned with discipleship in the Gospel of Matthew, in the Gospel of Mark rather. But I think the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke, when they retell these stories, are much more concerned to ensure we understand that the family of Jesus are really part of the mission. And that's even clearer in the Gospel of John, where Jesus' siblings and mother are on the road with him in Galilee. And they don't fully understand him, but then neither do the disciples. You know, no one understands Jesus in the Gospels. Yeah. Everyone gets it a little bit wrong. So there's no perfect disciple totally getting Jesus until you get to Mary and Martha and Bethany in the Gospel of John.
And it seems like the foot washing episode for John, for the author, whose testimony is primary throughout that gospel, that seems to be the shift right there, you know, in understanding Jesus' identity with the foot washing. And there is this interesting element though with his with this concept of family broadly, because in one sense you have got a curious scene in John's gospel where Jesus then entrusts the care of his mother to what seems like John, or the beloved disciple there, son of Zebedee, at the cross, which is just a curious thing that people have sort of questions about. But you've got this big focus on, after his resurrection, a specific appearance to James, and then the role that his family play in the ongoing leadership of the church. And so I'm curious to get your take on that.
Oh, James. Well, the whole story is just so interesting. Who is the beloved disciple? And of course, in Christian tradition, it is very much the Apostle John. Yeah. And it kind of if we identify the beloved disciple as the Apostle John, it's like saying, you know, people who are not my blood relatives are so close to me as brothers and sisters that they can be as my family. So I'm going to entrust my mother, who is my responsibility as the eldest child. I think that's also a clue that he was the eldest child.
Definitely.
To who I choose of my overall group of siblings, who might not be my blood family, but are in my family of faith. But James, in terms of blood family, it shows how close he was to Jesus all through his mission, I think. That the community there in Jerusalem want James to be in charge. And James couldn't just have assumed that role without everyone going, James, we want you to be in charge. You know,
particularly when Peter's hanging around there and he's been given some pretty important scenes with Jesus. Yeah, absolutely.
Peter, they might have had their doubts about Peter at that point, you know, given Peter running away. And
I've always thought that would have been a very difficult scene for him to replay, you know, where you've got Holy Saturday where they're all huddled together in fear and he's having to recount. Remember, Jesus predicted that you would deny him 3 times. What happened, Peter? And him having to sort of retell that story. Boy, just incredible.
Incredibly hard.
So this prompting then for Jesus to enter public ministry, and we'll just wrap this up in a sec here. You've got him moving then from his childhood years. He's studied Torah. He's grown to understand the Jewish law. He's arguing with the priests and the teachers of the law in Jerusalem as a boy, quite a precocious teenager. He's got sort of the responsibility of then training with his father. He's known to take on his father's trade, to care for his family. But then there's this shift then into sort of public ministry. What would you take around the influences on Jesus? Because there's been a fair bit done more recently in scholarship around John the Baptizer and whether he was influenced from the Essenes or the Qumran community. What role did he play in discipling Jesus? And is Jesus' baptism part of that broader picture? Any insights you've got just about that later part of Jesus's early years before we see him arrive on the scene with the public ministry?
Yeah, one of my first books was on John the Baptist, and I very much argued against the idea that John had anything to do with the Essenes and the Qumran community. So it's kind of interesting to me that that has again popped up as an idea. I think what happens is people look for parallels in Second Temple Judaism, but actually John was resourcing Isaiah and not anything contemporary. And both the Qumran community and John were resourcing Isaiah. So you can read that book on John the Baptist. The book is at the Mercer. And John was, it's interesting, John's arrival, given what had happened at the time of Archelaus when Herod died. There was revolution in Judea. This is the background now I see of John the Baptist more than I did at the time I wrote the book. In that, and it's the background to the Gospel of Matthew's nativity, that Herod dies, there's revolution, there's a huge camp out in the temple. Archelaus comes in and massacres everyone who's protesting in the temple and wanting liberation in Judea. There are a number of different revolutionary prophets arising, and this is all 4 BCE. Some 30 years later we get John the Baptist, who is by the River Jordan, and this is a very powerful place of crossing over to the promised land. There's echoes of Elijah being taken up to heaven at this point, into the clouds. By the River Jordan. It's very, very significant just in terms of his placement, but he's calling for a different kind of revolution. He's not calling for a revolution about taking up arms against Rome. He's calling for people to look inside themselves, to think in terms of what they should be doing, truly following God and preparing for God's action to transform the world. And I think that is just so profound, that John is doing something so different. And that triggers Jesus. He goes, this is my call out, really. This is my time. And something of what he's learned from his father, his own experience of dislocation, whatever is happening for him, he knows that this is the time that he needs to go to John and follow what John's path is, and see where that goes. And he builds then on John and takes off on his own mission.
And you've got that great development in all of them. I mean, Mark's gospel opens with this idea of prepare the way So that great Isaiah sort of tradition of John being one in the wilderness, calling, prepare the way of the Lord. And yeah, Jesus' ministry obviously takes off from there. But I just want to say thanks for the opportunity to dive into these infancy narratives about Jesus. I think people are curious about his early years, hence the heretical movie that's coming out, hence all of the Gnostic literature that tries to fill in those gaps of the early years of Jesus. But it is remarkable just slowing down and spending some time in Matthew 1 and 2, and then Luke 1 and 2, and drawing out what's happening here, and or what you would say the call and response between Matthew's gospel and the questions it raises, and then the response with Luke's gospel and the bits and pieces that it fills in from other source material. So thanks for being willing to come and field some questions. And your book, Boy Jesus, is a great one for people to pick up. It wanders chapter by chapter through some of the most interesting questions in and around this, and helps dive into the scholarship to create maybe a much more positive presentation of the historical kind of roots of these stories, and probably some of the more skeptical scholarship that you were referencing at the beginning of previous generations. So huge thanks for the book as well, and I'm sure many people will want to pick that up.
Thank you so much for having me today. Really enjoyed talking to you.
Great. Well, to everyone watching this far, just a big thanks for watching along. We hope it's been an encouragement for the first of a number of big Christmas episodes. It's great if you haven't already, pick up a gospel and actually read through these stories and what they present about the meaning of Christmas and the identity of Jesus. If you want to dig deep into some of the literature around the historical reliability of these stories and the Gospels more broadly, definitely pick up Joan's book. It's linked down in the show notes. It would be a great Christmas present for anyone interested in Jesus. We've got a number of scholars who've come on in the past, people like Peter Williams and Mike Lacona and John Dixon, Tim McGrew, and a range of others who help wrestle with some of the reliability questions around New Testament material. So check those episodes out, and until next time, truth invites questioning. We'll see you later.